Which Elden Ring area is the easiest, and which Elden Ring area is the hardest? I polled my viewers to vote for 26 different areas from Elden Ring on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being easy, 10 being hard, we worked out the averages and we have the results. I'm Billy S, and let's jump into this community ranking of Elden Ring's area difficulty with the easiest area. And stay tuned, as later on I'll be opening the poll for my next community ranking, where we rank the Soulsborne games based on their soundtracks. I'm leaving it over to you. At number 26, we have Castle Morn, which scored a total difficulty average of 3.15 out of 10. For this video, I'm looking at legacy dungeons, minor legacy dungeons, and other extremely important areas of exploration. But Castle Morn on the southernmost tip of the Weeping Peninsula is considered the easiest area in the game by all of you. It's one of the first major fortresses you can access after starting the game, and contains a valuable early weapon if you can complete it. You have to avoid stone golem archers on your way to the castle gates, a courtyard that is overrun with demi-humans, and a surprisingly tricky parkour section that leads you down the back half of the castle to the beaches beyond. None of the enemies here are particularly tricky, but they can pose an early game threat if you don't know what you're doing. There are multiple ways to climb in the battlements in Castle Morn, so you won't always take the same route to progress. Ultimately though, the enemy groups are lenient if you pull aggro carefully, there are multiple sites of grace to keep you company, and the final enemies blocking your path to the boss are some spectral jellyfish. Not exactly the scariest guard. Though the grafted greatsword, whose weapon skill buffs your stats for a short while, is definitely a fun investment and worth your time completing this dungeon for. At number 25, we have Redmane Castle, which scored a total difficulty average of 3.86 out of 10. Found in southern Caelid, this castle has distinct instances depending on when you visit. If it's during the Radahn festival, you have to take a warp gate that will leave you in the central courtyard and ready to face Radahn. This is the easy way in, getting you a grace nearby, but it doesn't allow you to explore the fortress with all the doors being locked. You have to come here either before triggering the festival or after completing the festival to get the usual enemy affairs. It's not a particularly brutal area by any means. There's a cool cliffside path you can use to break in or break out. There are lots of closed off rooms that you can loot for treasure, and aside from the terrifying lions on the main path, the rest of the enemies here, Redmane Knights included, aren't anything to write home about. You do have an annoying duo fight against a Leonine and Crucible Knight, but by the time you reach Redmane Castle, you've fought both of them before. It's nothing new. At number 24, we have the Ruin-strewn Precipice, which scored a total difficulty average of 3.99 out of 10. One of the more obtuse areas in this ranking, this is the cavern dungeon that you can take to reach Altus Plateau, assuming you don't find the two halves of the Dectus Medallion, the dungeon that ends in a battle against Magma Worm Makar. Because it's the difficulty of a regular cave dungeon, there isn't that much here to bolster this level's challenge. I think for me, the toughest part is with the bat creatures and the one that sings, because of the higher HP pool and their brutal aggression if you let them get their way. Otherwise, you're fighting stone miners, land octopi, and the most cunning foe of all that will make an appearance in many of these entries, gravity. It's not the easiest dungeon in the game, it's literally guarding the next explorable region after all, but compared to most of Elden Ring's major offerings, the Ruin-strewn Precipice cannot compare. Makar's super fun though, and they gave him a well-sized arena. I respect that. At number 23, we have Raya Lucaria, which scored a total difficulty average of 4.35 out of 10. When I did the poll, I split it into 2 pages, with the legacy dungeons on one page and all the other areas in the other. Raya Lucaria is our first legacy dungeon to appear on the list, and players feel very strongly that it is the easiest to traverse. I would say this level has a small learning curve, as I've seen a great deal of players get absolutely stagger-locked by the very first mages leading up to the main doorways. There are a few of those caged mannequins that also attack wildly in the entrance hall. They appear every once in a while as well, but for the most part the enemies are quite squishy and tame. You can just run through the lower graveyard to the lift leading upwards, and the path to the Red Wolf is also quite safe to burst through if you don't stop to kill every mage you see. And then, getting to Renala, you just have a jump to a ramp with a large boulder trap, and Moongrum, who is probably the hardest part of the entire Legacy dungeon. I'd say the optional path that leads to the other academy key is the hardest part of Raya Lucaria, with some hard-hitting enemies and some tricky parkour throughout with no real checkpoints if you mess up. But you have to consider most people will rate these areas based on what they dealt with on the critical path. And Raya Lucaria has one of the tamest critical paths in the game, even down to being way more linear than Stormveil Castle or Lane Dell as an example. It's an interesting ranking, because in the next couple entries you can decide for yourselves if Raya Lucaria is easier or harder than them. I'm not fully convinced by this position on the list, but we'll take this journey together. My viewers were the ones that voted. At number 22, we have Caria Manor, which scored a total difficulty average of 4.43 out of 10. The home of Rani the Witch, found in northern Liurnia, this manor is split into 3 sections: the approach and lower courtyard, the battlement bridges, and the upper area. Caria Manor really hits you when you approach by firing a series of magical projectiles that aim vaguely in your direction like a shower. You've got to steer torrent to avoid them and get inside. But once you're in, you face some of the most harrowing enemies in the game, the Finger Creepers. These sentient hands are fucking terrifying at the best of times, and they hide throughout the undergrowth. Some are attached to walls, others are buried beneath the ground like a bear trap. You have to fight them to get through, and they can overwhelm you very quickly with their large numbers and their large number of fingers. The battlements are a little more interesting, featuring ghostly spirits that attack you as you progress, and while it's totally possible to just run to the elevator at the end of the walkways, it's fun to try fighting the ghosts, especially when there's a drop-down nearby that will get you the Sword of Night and Flame, one of the strongest weapons in the game. The upper courtyard area before Loretta is the least interesting part of the manor though. You have some wolves and a large Carian troll standing between you and the boss, and surprise surprise, they are hilariously easy to run past. And you can even parkour around the troll to avoid waking it entirely. Caria Manor starts off brutal, but peters out in difficulty in the lead up to the boss, who is also not that difficult of a fight. Fun, but your standard fare. At number 21, we have Shifra River and Nokron the Eternal City, which scored a total difficulty average of 4.5 out of 10. This encompasses the underground area to the southeast of the Lands Between, where you'll find a whole manner of beasties to tackle. The lower part of the river, at least for me, is way more dangerous than the upper half. You can reach it much earlier in the game, so you're more squishy, enemies here can be quite tanky, and the ancestral followers have those variants who can snipe you from a mile away if you're not careful. And that's if the electrical elementals don't burst you down first with their electricity. Still, there is some good loot, you have an ancestor spirit, and you get to access Caelid for the Great Jar side quest. Upper Shifra is a mid-game area featuring a focus on platforming and tougher scaled enemies. The Mimic tier is barely a footnote, but you can run into a wild red wolf, there are Crucible Knights and the aqueduct to the north that leads to the Valiant Gargoyles, and you have Nokron the Eternal City, which while not the most difficult area to navigate, has a ton of tricky parkour and a few enemies that will surprise you. The orbs are more dangerous than anyone gives them credit for. But I think Shifra River in general, being a more open zone, makes the danger less condensed and thus easier to handle mentally. At number 20, we have Ainsel River and Noxtella, which scored a total difficulty average of 4.71 out of 10. I wasn't expecting both of these river areas to land back to back, but that's how the cookie crumbles, and I'm glad we can at least agree that Ainsel River and Noxtella are tougher than Shifra and Nokron. Ainsel River is all about dealing with those giant ants that can scurry around and distract you at the best of times. You have to deal with the stone miners at the ruins, who have the poise of Havel the Rock. There's a half-formed Estelle that fires gravity chunks at you, and then basilisks just to top it all off. The tunnels are dense and claustrophobic. I hated them on my first run because I was convinced a giant spider was going to come out and eat me. It was a Dragonkin soldier instead, which is significantly cooler. But the aesthetics give you more pause for progress than Shifra. There's a bit more of an unnerving atmosphere here. And Noxtella, while it's easy to rush through the lower river to the elevator leading to the Lake of Rot, can be quite tricky if you decide to actually loot the city of its treasure. Silver tears that act like the phalanx enemies from early Souls, even more giant orbs, one of which created one of the funniest Elden Ring clips of all time, and the Nox monks and swordstress enemies whose flexible weapons can end your career. I've died a few times near the end of this city, it always feels brutal doing that run back. Less platforming deaths though than Nocron, that's nice. At number 19, we have the Shaded Castle, which scored a total difficulty average of 4.82 out of 10. This is Elema's domain, a fortress surrounded by fetid poison pools and battlements with tough enemies. There are quite a few perfumers hanging around here who have always been a big struggle for me in Elden Ring. They just know how to back off and blast you with sense. The poison pools themselves aren't the worst to explore, but the area does come with some royal revenants that can spawn in certain locations, and that immediately brings the difficulty up. They are one of the few enemies that always makes an area tougher by merely existing in this game. There's also some Clean Rot Knights who are stationed here that need to be dealt with, who can be very tricky enemy types, as you won't have encountered many of them up to this point. Luckily, once you're in the main castle, progression is linear, with you needing to work your way upwards to the upper halls where Elema awaits. I find the hardest part of the Shaded Castle is the first half with the poison, collecting all the items and extra goodies in the pools and the surrounding area. And it's over much sooner than some of the areas coming up on the list, so even though it is a step up in difficulty for Altus Plateau, it's not enough to make it out of the bottom 10 in terms of easiness on this list. At number 18, we have Stormveil Castle, which scored a total difficulty average of 4.87 out of 10. And funnily enough, Stormveil had the 4th most votes for easiest area with 178. But that metric was at the end of the form the voters filled out. I listed every location and told them to select the 5 easiest from a list, and I think people gravitated to Stormveil there due to its legacy dungeon status. But is it actually one of the easiest areas in the game? No, I don't think it is. Though a 4.87 is a fair assessment when using Elden Ring as the metric. It's the first legacy dungeon that players are supposed to visit, and it has a level of interconnectivity and progression that can rival the world of Dark Souls. Your journey is a constant series of choices that branch you into different paths that all eventually lead to Godric. Do you take the gate or the side path? Do you go through the rooftops or the streets? Do you detour to the Divine Tower? Do you go to the hidden path beneath the castle to find Godwyn's corpse? Do you fight the secret Crucible Knight on the outer side of the cliffs? There's so much to see and do here that you're bound to come across a difficult early game obstacle at least once. But in that same vein, if you've played Elden Ring enough, you know the exact layout of Stormveil and the most efficient way to actually reach Godric. And taking that route can be surprisingly chill. You don't have to face many of the more difficult moments, like the birds in their barrels, or cleaning out a courtyard of ballista snipers. Hell, you can just go through the jar room to reach the boss Grace without fighting the big golem on the main path. Stormveil is a microcosm of Elden Ring. It is as hard as you want to make it, and in that sense, it could have landed anywhere on this list in terms of difficulty, and I think I could sell you that with ease. Dare I say, I think Stormveil is still quite low on this ranking, especially compared to a few areas coming up, but that's more of a testament on how different each Elden Ring playthrough can be for every player. At number 17, we have the Deeproot Depths, which scored a total difficulty average of 5 out of 10. Love it when we get a whole number! The Deeproot Depths are the decaying ruins beneath the Erd Tree, filled to the brim with headless spirits, basilisks, and giant ants. This area is inhospitable, and yet home to some rather interesting equipment. Siluria's Spear from the Siluria Crucible Knight boss, the cave that contains Elden Stars, the signature move of the Elden Beast, and of course, who could forget going up to fight Fia's champions and the Lich Dragon as part of her questline, all of which are difficult on their own. But then combine them with the Deeproot Depths being a bit of a pain to navigate due to how many enemies ambush you, then add that climbing up to Godwyn's corpse sees you parkouring across roots strung up high from the ground, and there are enemies constantly firing lasers at you, and I can see why some people rank Deeproot around this point in the list. I think there is an ongoing debate as to which of the underground areas is truly the most difficult, because it's a hard comparison to make. Deeproot Depths doesn't have an eternal city to explore like Shifra River and Ainsel River, and it's way more open than Ainsel River was, which is the more difficult of the two according to you guys. So it's kind of like grading apples and oranges. Let me know what you think of Deeproot Depths and the other underground areas in the comments below. At number 16 is the Lake of Rot, which scored a total difficulty average of 5.48 out of 10. This also includes the Grand Cloister, found moments after. Now, a cynical viewer would say, oh, this should be ranked way lower because you can just run through the entire lake, healing as you go on a suicide run to the Grand Cloister Grace. I understand that mentality, I really do. But with area and level rankings, the point is to engage with what the level is throwing at you, and I do think the Lake of Rot is a zone that almost incentivizes you to die multiple times. You use pressure plates to raise structures from the lake, allowing you to walk further out without getting millenniaed. There are basilisks and other enemies hidden beneath the water waiting to jump out at you, but if you're careful, you can get through them lickety-split. Then you reach the Grand Cloister, and the Kindred of Rot Brigade all shoot you with their homing missiles that always find their mark, and you realize your life's been miserable and will continue to be miserable. Fuck the Kindred of Rot! Even more so if you then willingly decide to go back and face the Dragonkin soldier in the center of the Lake of Rot, which is one of my most hated boss encounters in all of Soulsborne. I think it sucks, and it's most certainly difficult. But at least all of the difficult aspects of the Lake of Rot are either optional or run-pastable, and that's what keeps it in the lower half of the ranking despite a healthy 73 votes for hardest area. At number 15, we have Midra's Manse, which scored a total difficulty average of 5.49 out of 10. The first of the DLC areas to feature in this video, we have to take certain elements into account when discussing Shadow of the Erdtree locations. Mainly, that difficulty is more subjective than ever due to the Shadow Tree fragment system. Depending on when you encounter the areas in the DLC, you may have more or less Shadow Tree fragments than the average player. But even then, I think by the time most people get to Midra's Manse, they've likely found enough of them to get through the DLC pretty comfortably. I'll even throw the Abyssal Woods into this entry because dodging senile old men in the grass is kinda scary, if a bit slow and steady. Then you get to the Manse, and you have the ghosts of Ballarat Knights and a host of Inquisitors to deal with. The halls are claustrophobic and cramped, and progression isn't always obvious, with you needing to manipulate switches and discover illusory walls to progress. I always remember the dining room, because an enemy on the second floor throws a projectile that absolutely shreds through your health if you don't see it coming. I also remember the big Chungus in the second half, the rotund Inquisitor, who isn't hard, I just remember him. Midra himself likely adds to the difficulty a tad, but overall the Manse isn't a large zone. It's more of a mini-dungeon with the aesthetics of a full legacy dungeon, and because of that quickness of completion, it doesn't stick around long enough to veer into truly difficult territory, with only a handful of actual enemies that prove threatening. At number 14, we have the Volcano Manor, which scored a total difficulty average of 5.57 out of 10, missing out on the top half of this list by just 0.02 points. It's the third legacy dungeon on the list, but I do completely agree with the viewers here. The Volcano Manor is an interesting level. The first half is quite linear, with you working anti-clockwise around the Torture Settlement to reach the temple with the Godskin Noble. You have segments with the lava, but the lava is barely a tickle in Elden Ring. You've got snake guys that stretch and try to kill you. There's the house with the Albinoric prisoners that also try to kill you. But most of the tough parts here come from optional rooms with the Virgin Abductors who try to kill you, or the hidden magma worm down an elevator that tries to kill you. The second half of the Legacy Dungeon is much tougher for me. Parkouring up to the crater of the volcano and facing tougher enemies on your way to Rykard's Waygate is something I will never forget. I specifically remember the snake enemy that has the flaming whip that drips molten lava on the ground. He was a real pain. And again, there are a lot of optional areas with tough enemies and good loot if you go off the beaten path. Overall, the list of enemies that are actually quite threatening to the player on the main path of Volcano Manor are quite slim. The danger more so comes from traversal, the potential to mess up a jump or to spend too long in the lava until you don't have any healing left, or even just underestimating an enemy and suddenly watching that health drain away. Hey, you made it halfway through the video, so I can tell you the next community ranking is in the description. You can fill out the poll right now. We're ranking the soundtracks of the Soulsborne series from worst to best. So if you want to participate, pop on down and get involved, and maybe consider backstabbing that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of my future videos. We really want to reach 50,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and we are on the way, so come on, join in. And let's move on to number 13. At number 13, we have Castle Ensis, which scored a total difficulty average of 5.59 out of 10. This is the minor legacy dungeon that halts your progress to Shadow Altus in the DLC, and is a magical fort that feels like if everyone in Raya Lucaria was trained for war and not research. You have to cross a deadly bridge with projectiles being shot your way, take down a Carian Cuckoo Knight, climb a large hill and cave which gets you to a cross of Mikola, hop down into a river and climb up on the other side to unlock a shortcut. You might get killed by some dogs, it'll probably be funny. Climb up the next fortress where you face Moonrathil, who is even harder than Moongrum from Raya Lucaria, and then you take a stroll along the battlements with tough enemies, ending with a Black Knight that blocks your path to Rallana. I'd say the toughest moments happen after the river sequence, because before you even reach Moonrathil, you're ambushed by these teleporting nobles who are weak in terms of health, but snipers in terms of their ability to irritate you. And then you get two-shot by Moonrathil and you've got to deal with the old men all over again. And this NPC almost certainly will deplete your HP reserves, leaving you with barely any healing to overcome the Black Knight before the elevator up to Rallana. Not to mention the boss herself, who is one of the toughest in the DLC, irregardless of when you fight her. Her combos are insane, her magic is damaging, and her room wides will find you. But the first half of Castle Ensis isn't anything to write home about, and it's not too hard to loot the entire dungeon. There's not much in the way of optional difficulty. It's all about having those Shadow Tree fragments to mitigate the damage. At number 12, we have the Stone Coffin Fissure, which scored a total difficulty average of 5.65 out of 10. Found at the southern tip of the Cerulean coast, this hidden chasm leads directly to St. Trina, and yet to get to her is to solve the puzzle that is this area. Getting in is pretty simple. You drop down some platforms, reach your first grace, and avoid all the enemies that know how to inflict sleep. But to get from there to the grace before the final drop is a real test. This area is littered with abnormal stone clusters. In the base game, these guys were mostly goofy creatures that chilled near Everjails. Here in the Stone Coffin Fissure, they are deadly turrets who don't give you a moment's breathing room. By the time you reach and defeat one of them, you'll have a second firing at you from a spot you couldn't have predicted. This continues throughout the area as you're having to adapt to each moment as it comes, and it can get pretty brutal towards the midpoint. You also have a rematch against a misbegotten Crusader, the harder variant of the Leonine boss, which is a cruel placement right before the final grace. And tougher still is the Putrescent Knight awaiting you in the depths. One of the weirdest moving bosses in FromSoft's lineup with tells I can barely read 2 years later. The Stone Coffin Fissure is similar to the Volcano Manor, all about navigation, but this time the navigation is punctuated by snakes shooting you with lasers and birds flying at you with swords, which makes everything a lot more tense and a lot more difficult. I think it makes sense to land in the top half of this list, even if it is just barely. At number 11, we have Mohgwyn Palace, which scored a total difficulty average of 5.95 out of 10. All hail the Lord of Blood and his secret underground base. Real talk though, how did he get so much blood down here? The geysers and the rotting animals and the red Albinaurics are quite haunting, but I have to say, Mohg is committed to the drip. The first half of Mohgwyn Palace is the outer grounds, where you'll find most of the interesting stuff, the Vare invasions, and the best farming spot in the base game. And by god, I have died so many times in this swamp, it's not even funny. There's something inherently deadly about it, beyond the ability for bleed build-up to accrue. They picked some of the toughest enemies and said either get on torrent and go, or suffer. And if you approach the palace, there's a spectral skeleton that can shoot beams waiting to snipe your ass. It's funny because once you reach the actual mountain, the level gets really easy. Outside, it's just slaughtering weak hollows and a few horrifying bleed masses before you enter a cavern where sanguine nobles ambush you every few minutes. But that's okay, those are regular enemies, you've maybe fought them before. They're like baby Mohgs. If anything, I think it's insane that there's a shopkeeper in here. Bro, you think people are gonna buy your stock? Come on. I do love that last courtyard before the final elevator though, where you can see a procession of Mohg's followers vibing, and it's up to you to interrupt them so you can take their treasure and slaughter them. Always leads to a fun group confrontation. And Mohg is, of course, one of the toughest fights in the game. You all ranked him as the 5th hardest base game boss, with a difficulty average of 7.95, you can check out that video if you're interested. and he is the 9th hardest boss in all of Elden Ring if you include my DLC boss difficulty ranking from a few years ago. You can also check that video out if you're interested. It makes sense that he would raise the difficulty of the place, but even then, a 5.95 is pretty tame in the grand scheme of things, and yet accurate given the difficulty imbalance between the first half of the level and the second half of the level. Love how it works out. At number 10, we have the Ancient Ruins of Rao, which scored a total difficulty average of 6.16 out of 10. There's a bit of debate as to whether you should consider this area a legacy dungeon. It's open air and the same size as a regular region in Shadow of the Erdtree, but in terms of progression and exploration, it has more in common with traditional legacy dungeons. You're not finding any alternate paths to new areas. At most, you'll be discovering optional caverns filled with horrifying spider-scorpion hybrids that need to be flamethrowed immediately, or you'll be discovering hidden ruin parkour that eventually leads you to a rematch against the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, while the rest of the area is focused on linear progression paths through 2 distinct islands with a boss fight at the end. It's more like Castle Ensis than Gravesite Plain, as an example. I love how difficult Rao can be if you're taking it slow. There are a few curse blades strewn about, the aforementioned scorpions, and a host of regular enemies that can catch you off guard if you're not careful with projectiles. Devonia, the Crucible Knight, awaits you near the halfway point, followed by a Furnace Golem, who tests your parkour skills and torrent dodge timings. Then the second half of the ruin sees you fighting Divine Birdmen, who are some of the coolest designs in the game. There are also enemies throwing fire downstairs that you have to climb, and towards the very end, you reach the Kindred of Rot hallways where you have to be very careful lest you get homing missiled into oblivion by their pest threads. If you're just trying to reach Ramina, who is a fantastic and fairly challenging boss fight, it's not that difficult to rush through the ruins with the right routing, but there'll be at least 1 or 2 enemies who catch you off guard and force you to stop. There's more challenge here than in many of the areas we've covered, and I think it's a great achievement that an area like Rao can make it into this top 10. At number 9, we have Castle Soul, which scored a total difficulty average of 6.32 out of 10. This is the second hardest of the non-legacy dungeons in today's ranking, but what I find interesting about Castle Soul is that it all comes down to a handful of interactions as opposed to the entire area. Yes, you've got the return of Warhawks on the ground level, who can ambush you alongside regular soldiers. This is also the same castle that has you rushing along battlements to reach an optional painting while soldiers fire at you with ballistas, and it requires perfection to get across. There are also lions at the entrance you need to deal with, though they are next to the Site of Grace, so it's easy to reattempt them if you have a bad run. Commander Nile is a fairly tough boss that you need to have the right equipment levels to deal with, thanks to the spirits he can summon and his HP pool. Look, we're rewarded the other half of the Haligtree Medallion if we succeed here. The difficulty has to ramp up. But let's be real, the true reason why Castle Soul is in our top 10 is because of that single dual-wielding Banish Knight on the optional path to the Cerulean Amber Medallion +1. This man has styled on everyone who has ever approached him with his ability to walk behind you instant transmission style. I've made a few goofy edits on him in the past. Sometimes a truly infamous enemy can ramp an area's difficulty sky high, even more impressive when it's an optional encounter that just happens to still be everyone's canon experience. At number 8, we have Belorat Tower Settlement, which scored a total difficulty average of 6.49 out of 10. The easiest of the DLC Legacy dungeons, Belorat still provides a nice challenge because most players will approach the settlement long before they have enough Shadow Tree fragments to trivialize the danger. Though even then, Belorat is an interesting case, because the very basic Shadowmen enemies that populate a majority of the settlement aren't even a threat at the best of times. They're squishy, slow, easy to read. They lull you into a false sense of security. Because once you make it to the halfway point, that's when Belorat begins to introduce horned warriors to the game. These are the Silver Knights of Belorat, as a comparison to the older titles, and they have a lot of stamina, a lot of power, and the ability to produce specific AoEs with certain combos. They're often placed at inopportune spots and require skill to beat, or the knowledge on how to sneak around them, especially for the one on the bridge further up. We also have the room with the spider scorpions, we have grave birds, there's the curse blade right before the end of the area, and the extremely difficult boss fight against the Divine Beast Dancing Lion that follows. We've also got the surprisingly tough encounter with Queeline in one of the middle courtyards, and optionally we have the poison pools that you can unlock with a specific key from Upper Ballarat, complete with its own host of tough enemies to deal with, and dare you take the plunge to get the Euphoria at the end of the game, which starts off in Enira Lim, but leads to a tough platforming jump into Ballarat that also goes down to a host of hidden elevators to reach this powerful Twin Blade. I still think it's a bit of an underwhelming zone compared to some of the other Legacy dungeons with how the regular mobs are so weak, but it makes the tougher elite enemies feel more threatening, and I have to wonder if that was by design. At number 7, we have Lanedale Royal Capital, which scored a total difficulty average of 6.6 out of 10. It may be my favourite area in all of Soulspawn, but in terms of difficulty, landing in the 6-7 range feels correct. It's a mid-game dungeon that transitions you into the late game, with a challenging pair of bosses awaiting you at the very end. I'll also just throw the Ashen Capital in as part of this category, because it was too basic to include as its own entry, so that one room with the ulcerated tree spirits to get the upgraded Erdtree's Favor Talisman, let's pop that on the Barbie as well. Lanedale's initial difficulty mainly comes from where the hell do you go? It's not immediately clear that the path forwards is up the corpse of a giant dragon's wing. Most FromSoft players wouldn't even think to initially climb it, meaning many of us spent our time exploring the city streets. There's a Crucible Knight guarding an early shortcut, an Erdtree avatar, and an ulcerated tree spirit ambush. You have the sewer path with the finger creepers that you can use to sneak around, or you can take on the streets themselves and the Lanedale soldiers, many of whom use electricity to attack with melee swings and ranged greatbow snipes. It feels like no matter where you go, you will always find an enemy that can challenge you and drain your healing flasks, and as you progress, it only gets tougher. A Valiant Gargoyle, duelists on the path to the Colosseum, a second Crucible Knight has hit the Pentagon near the Marika Radagon statue, and how about that super tough golem atop the elevator near the Round Table? Or if you really want to stretch things out, the bridge leading to the Forbidden Lands is technically still a part of Lanedale, with cavalry units and the Omen Twins boss fight. Once you have a path and you know where the Graces are, you can get through Lanedale, but it's far riskier than doing that strategy with Stormveil or Raya Lucaria. You have way more chances of running into tougher foes. But Lanedale just hits that sweet spot. It's not too easy, nor is it too hard. It's just right for that point in the game, something I think is really important to keep in mind as we get higher and higher in this difficulty ranking. And that doesn't even take into account all of the bosses. If they were included, I think this area would bump up a few decimal places. But how about we move on from Lanedale for now, or more accurately, let's move underneath Lanedale for now. At number 6, we have the Subterranean Shunning Grounds, which scored a total difficulty average of 7.09 out of 10, and this is the final non-legacy dungeon on today's list. Elden Ring's answer to the depths from Dark Souls. This underground sewer complex is home to various omens who are shunned from society, a real underbelly for Lanedale. You have powerful omens in the main corridors who can absolutely decimate a character with subpar stat allocation, and they keep popping up throughout the level just to make your heart race right before you reach a checkpoint or shortcut. This very specific omen before this ladder late into the zone has always been my kryptonite. Navigation has been mentioned a lot in this video, but nowhere is it tougher than the Shunning Grounds, because you're combining an area with a very samey visual aesthetic, and then being thrown into cramped pipes and told, find the way forwards if you can, suckers! We've got classic dead ends, pits that drops you into Room of Horrors, there's a Royal Revenant who is placed in such an evil spot that I thought I was playing a horror game, and gravity is surprisingly deadly here, as you're not only exploring inside pipes, but atop them as well. I have a lot of gravity-related deaths trying to rush this level, when I'm not getting cornered by strong enemies in a dead end, of course. Shortcuts are plentiful, but feel rewarding to unlock, and while I do think the Omen enemies are spammed a little too much in the main area, I can't deny that it does work in making you feel unwelcome and uneasy. Oh, and we got Giant Shrimp and an optional Catacomb, that's a new one. Luckily, by the time you reach Sewer Moog, he's not actually that difficult by comparison. This area ranks this high purely because it's tough on a first visit because you have no clue where to go, and on a second visit, you still have no clue where to go because you've probably forgotten the correct path. Or maybe that's just me. I didn't forget to backstab that subscribe button though. Yeah, that's a segue, Billy. Yeah, we're trying to reach 50,000 subscribers. I'd be real humbled if you felt like helping out. On to the top 5. At number 5, we have the Shadow Keep, which scored a total difficulty average of 7.47 out of 10. Easily the largest of the legacy dungeons in the series, there is no shortage of things to face in the Shadow Keep. No matter your entry point, you are bound to face some sort of adversity that will challenge your skills. If you take the Hippo entrance, you have to face a series of soldiers in the barracks, some of whom can knock you into the void if you're not careful. Please tell me I'm not the only one. If you take the Flooded Church entrance, you have to face a series of parkour challenges across floating platforms, while explosive hollows and fire knights try to battle you back. And both pathways lead to the Specimen Storehouse, where if you're not comfortable fighting Messmer's fire knights, you will have to learn quickly. This is on top of more parkour needed to reach higher elevations, which could also see you falling to your death yet again. Whether you're heading up to Messmer and the rafters beyond, or down to the infirmary wing with the Jar Shamans, the Shadow Keep always has you by the neck in terms of both progression and combat. Two very distinct enemy encounters stay in my mind though. The first is the Fire Knight found in the Flooded Church district who summons explosive hollows to protect themselves, while the second is the Fire Knight found right before Messmer's Fog Gate, a powerful elite soldier who can take you down even if you've got a fully realized build. The good thing about the Shadow Keep though is that because of how much of it is optional, you can really tailor your experience here. If you prefer parkour, you don't have to do the Hippo, or vice versa. You also don't need to go into the rafters to get to Gaius, assuming you're just speedrunning the DLC to kill Messmer and go straight to Rao. Honestly, I think they could have gone further with the Shadow Keep's difficulty, but what we got is definitely a tough time and well worthy of being this high on the list. At number 4, we have Crumbling Farah Missoula, which scored a total difficulty average of 7.65 out of 10. The final legacy dungeon of the base game's main path, I think it's fitting that the level containing Destined Death is considered one of the toughest. All of the hardest enemies appear here. The Beastmen of Farah Missoula are like the descendants of the Snake Men from Dark Souls 3's Archdragon Peak, with there being different variants that all hit like a truck. Shout out to the ones that can summon electricity to strike where you stand, they're the most annoying. But Farah Missoula is more famous for its dragons. They don't appear often in the levels, but when they do, they're absolutely brutal to try and fight. You're always better off just running past them, because fighting in any of their arenas is a recipe for disaster. Worm faces have infested the lower half of the early portion too, making exploration there a real pain in the ass if you want to go off the beaten path, while staying on the critical path brings you to a series of parkour along the floating debris until the Godskin Duo building, which is also flanked by powerful knights that deal devastating strikes. Later on, we've got a Crucible Knight protecting a nearby Site of Grace, a dragon who focuses on AoE damage as you approach, multiple optional paths containing deadly encounters like Banal's Invasion, another Crucible Knight, or the path to Dragon Lord Placidus Axe. And right before the boss door is a Draconic Tree Sentinel that you really need to kill before entering the fight against Malekith. Bringing back a boss as a regular enemy is a telltale sign that this is a tough legacy dungeon. Crumbling Farah Missoula also just has the aesthetic vibe of a difficult level. It oozes that sense of scale and that sense of danger, from the crumbled ruins to the whirling tornado. It all comes together to create one of the most impactful locations in all of Elden Ring. Tough enemies, tough bosses, tough terrain, but ultimately manageable with a high-level build. Unlike the areas coming up. At number 3, we have Miquella's Halig Tree, which scored a total difficulty average of 7.85 out of 10. The first half of the toughest optional dungeon in the game, the Halig Tree takes us from the topmost branches to the end of Loretta's boss arena in the little village below. Immediately, it asserts itself as a challenging zone with its pure focus on careful movement and platforming. If you make a wrong move, or you attack one too many times, you'll find yourself dating gravity all the way to the ocean floor. But that's not enough to make a level difficult. The enemies have to also encourage that outcome, with hostile ants that crawl along the branches, and various Oracle envoys who fire golden bubbles that attempt to knock you into the void. The giant Oracle envoy that protects the last part of the branches leading to the safety of the village below is a homing sniper, and I always find myself beelining it past him as quickly as I can because his bubbles do insane damage. But the village below ain't much better. Spirit Caller snails summon spirits to harass you on the rooftops, and depending on the paths you take, you can run into Leonine Misbegottens who are tough at the best of times, but when you're in an area with less space to move around, they are deadly. I've also never had a good run-in with the battle mages at the end of this area, right before Loretta's boss arena. I don't know what to tell you, the Gavel of Hymer comes for us all apparently. Trying to navigate branches and then the elven-inspired village, despite there being not that much room to fight, is a skill that not many of us have at the best of times, all because Loretta took up that real estate for her boss arena. Miquella's Haligtree is impressive in its difficulty because it's one half of a larger complex. Elfile Brace of the Haligtree is the other half, and it's obviously more difficult, but that didn't stop the upper Haligtree from getting that recognition it deserved for being its own layer of challenge. Does that make any sense? Speaking of Elfile, by the way, at number 2, we have Elfile Brace of the Haligtree, which scored a total difficulty average of 8.6 out of 10. The second half of Miquella's gardening project, Elfile is the toughest base game area in Elden Ring, and on a good day, could be the toughest in the entire game. The Haligtree, Elfile, and our number 1 spot all have one thing in common for me. They are areas that, no matter how much I try to clear by meticulously defeating every single enemy, I simply can't. The enemies are just overwhelmingly dangerous, and it's always better to know your route and press on. But in Elfile, that is so much easier said than done. There are multiple putrid avatars stationed throughout, with one guarding the site of grace leading to the second half. There are Cleanrot Knights and other tough enemies placed in strategic locations so that as you progress along the battlements and pathways, you will always be in the sight of someone deadly. And if you try to go below into the courtyards, you will face not one, but multiple royal revenants who will chase you all the way to the exit ladder. For some reason, I always remember these putrid Crystallians on one of the side paths who overwhelmed me when I tried to fight them. There's also the ulcerated tree spirit near the end of Millicent's questline that drove me up the wall, especially as if it kills you, the walk back is painful because of the river of rot you have to run through. And I still remember the second half of Elfile when you're at the church just before Melania, and you have the opportunity to go outside into the greenery. I wanted to get the bell bearing out there as part of my playthrough, and I recall getting my shit rocked by Kindreds of Rot and Cleanrot Knights. There's a lot to see, do, and find throughout Elfile, and some of the items are fantastic, but the difficulty of collecting them all is high, especially when most of them are guarded by some of the toughest enemies in the series. I will never forget being chased down by those royal revenants that first time. And yet the hardest area in Elden Ring wouldn't grace our screens until the DLC. At number 1, we have Enir, which scored a total difficulty average of 8.7 out of 10. You all voted, and you feel the final legacy dungeon of Shadow of the Erdtree is the most difficult area in all of Elden Ring. And while I was initially surprised to see it ranked this high, I thought about it a lot and realized I agree. See, Enir is funny because it starts off really tame. You warp in from the ruins of Rao, get your first grace, fight a few inquisitors, it's all very subdued to start with. But the moment you reach your first divine warrior, which summons the power of lightning and fights with an enhanced moveset that you will die to a few times, Enir puts its high-heeled stiletto on your neck and it never lets up. There are the 3 divine warriors, each with their own power-up, lightning, ice, and wind. The ice one being the most dangerous because it's fought on some awkward rooftops, the blizzard it forms deals AoE damage, and it rips through your health like a paper towel. The wind one is pretty tame, you can run past him to the next grace unless he gets you in his grab and yeets you into the air. But Enir has other enemies to worry about. Monks that can spam the Spira spell until you either die or you die, there is no other option. This bloody staircase to the second grace of the level is infamously one of my most hated segments in any Souls game. And you have to come back down here for the optional Euphoria parkour path as well, that's just insulting. Even the birds are brutal in Enir. You think they're super tame and suddenly they're throwing magic at you, and then the next minute you're dead. Optional paths have tough enemies, the graces are really spaced out to make you think about your next move. I remember my first time through panicking because I couldn't tell the progression path after beating the Ice Divine Warrior and going the wrong way and suffering the consequences. Oh, and depending on who you ask, Leda isn't always considered a boss fight by some people because she doesn't have a traditional boss health bar, so her battle could theoretically apply to this difficulty ranking. And I've gone on record talking about how brutal the damage is in her fight, overtuned to hell, but still very entertaining no matter the configuration. Except for Hornsent. Fuck Hornsent. You can tell people didn't take Radahn into consideration for this ranking though, or Enir would be in the 9s, easily. Still, it earns its top spot ranking as the hardest area in all of Elden Ring. Thanks for watching, adios.